everyone and welcome to a new video. Today we're going to be talking about my spring reading plans. That's my reading from March until May. I love planning my reading across months because that way you get to dive deeper into authors or themes or genres, and I think in future I'd quite like to do these seasonal kind of reading plans rather than monthly TBRs. So I picked out 12 books and I've split them into rough categories. I'll probably read more than 12 books over the 3 months, but I like to not be too prescriptive with my reading plans. I like to leave room to add books in, potentially take some out. I find that if I'm too rigid, I will naturally start to rebel against my own lists. So 12 books, I've split them into kind of groupings and you'll see some themes emerging as we go along. I'll update you guys in my monthly reading wrap-ups. Earlier this week I posted my February reading wrap-up, so that's live on the channel now. I should also say as well that some of these books I own copies of, as you'll see. Some of them I've got from the library on my Kobo, and some of them I'm yet to get copies of, in which case I'll pop them up somewhere on the screen for everybody to see what I'm talking about. Right, let's go ahead and make a start. I have a nice coffee because it's the beginning of spring and you might want a tea or a coffee, and let's make a start. The first book is Rural Hours by Harriet Baker. I've had my eye on this book for quite a while. I've been waiting for it to come out in paperback, but it popped up on my library's Libby New in Books as I was scrolling through on my iPad and having a look through, and I was absolutely delighted. This book is a literary biography on the rural lives of Virginia Woolf, Sylvia Townsend Warner, and Rosamond Lehman, 3 authors which I'm familiar with but in different degrees. I'm having a very serendipity moment with this book because it's perfect timing. The library getting in a copy. I'd just ordered a new book by Virginia Woolf that I haven't read, some of her essays. Last year I was recommended a book by Sylvia Townsend Warner called The Corner That Held Them, which I have on my Kobo, and I have been meaning to get to Rosamond Lehman, either Dusty Answer or The Weather in the Streets. So this was perfect timing, and what I'd like to do with this one is read this alongside as reading other works by those 3 authors. This is such a me book because I love the English countryside. I'm absolutely fascinated by novels that have a rural setting or rural influences. I love authors in the interwar period, so the 2030s and kind of like early 40s as well. I've had my eye on all of these works by all of these women for such a long time, so I cannot tell you how excited I am to get to this. The first work that I have to read alongside Rural Hours is The Common Reader Volume 1 by Virginia Woolf. I've had my eyes on this for quite a while. Whenever I read essays about books about books, they always mention Virginia Woolf says, Middlemarch is, Virginia Woolf says this on the Brontes, and I think it's taken from the Common Reader volumes. In this there are essays on Chaucer, Elizabethan plays, Austen, Eliot, Joseph Conrad. I love reading books by authors on other authors. I have an E.M. Foster called Aspects of the Novel, which I'm also hoping to get to relatively soon at some point this year. But I love seeing their thoughts and kind of what their assessment is of other writers. So this is the first one, Essays on Other Novelists by Virginia Woolf. The second book that I'll be reading alongside Rural Hours is The Corner That Held Them by Sylvia Townsend Warner, which I'll put somewhere here. I have a copy of this on my Kobo waiting to go that I got late last year. This was published in 1948 and is a work of historical fiction set in a convent in the 14th century, which, let me tell you, I cannot wait to get to this. I love the 14th century, and I think that this covers the Black Death arriving in England, the peasants' revolt. I love historical fiction. I've had nothing but praise about this novel, so I'm really hoping it kind of lives up to my expectations. As an aside, I really do want to get to a book called The Eagle and the Heart by Helen Castor, which was longlisted for the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction, which covers the same time period, Richard II to Henry IV. But I don't own a physical copy of this. My general rule of thumb is if I've never read anything by an author before, I won't buy a physical copy of the book until I've read a copy on my Kobo, or previously my Kindle, just in case, because you never know, you're never quite 100% until you've read the book. But that is the Sylvia Townsend Warner book that I'll be reading. Also, alongside Rural Hours, I really want to get to a Rosamond Lehman. I think what I'm going to read by her is The Weather in the Street, which I'll put here. Same rules apply. I've never read anything by her before, so I'll track down a copy on my Kobo before I go ahead and buy the paperback. There is a Ravago modern classic edition of The Weather in the Streets, which I think was published in the 1930s. I came across Rosamond Lehman years ago because I listened to an episode of Backlisted where they talked about this novel. I've always had it in my head that I would like to get to her, but I've never quite managed it until I've kind of had this prompt. I also really like the look of Dusty Answer, An Invitation to Waltz, but this seems to be the one that most people recommend. If I get along well with this, I'll certainly head to other works by her. So that is Virginia Woolf, Sylvia Townsend Warner and Rosamond Lehman, which I'll read alongside or just after I finish Rural Hours. Next up is Young Romantics by Daisy Hay, the Shelleys, Byron and Other Tangled Lives. Last year I listened to a series on The Rest is History, which is a podcast that I love about Byron. I found it so fascinating, so interesting, so dark, that when I was on holiday in the Lake District at Wordsworth House in Grasmere, they had this book and I knew I had to get it. I've had it on my TBR ever since then. I'm headed back to the Lake District in May, so I'd love to read this before then. The Romantics, Keats, etc., they have such a kind of interesting relationship with the Lake District, so I'd love to have read this. What I might do alongside this is potentially reread Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, and I may well get to some poetry of Percy Bysshe Shelley and potentially a little bit of Byron as well. This book, I've read the beginning of this book and it opens as the author is walking to the Protestant cemetery in Rome where John Keats is buried. I've also done that walk too, so I think I'm really gonna like this. I have very high hopes and I will let you know how I get on, because Young Romantics or later Romanticism is in that Regency time period. I am going to head to a novel called Troy Chimneys by Margaret Kennedy, which is a novel written in the 1940s, I believe 48, and is a work of historical fiction set in the Regency era. Now, I've been recommended Margaret Kennedy for years. I used to work with a bookseller who really loved The Constant Nymph, which I think is the work she's most famous for. This is a work of historical fiction written in the 1950s, and it follows a Victorian gentleman as he's convalescing. He's working through family papers and comes across the papers of an ancestor of his from the Regency period who is kind of recounting his life. This sounds fantastic. I've heard really good things about this, so I'm hoping lives up to expectations. I will track down a digital copy of this, and if I like it, I will certainly buy a paperback. Next up, we are headed to George Orwell. Last month, I read a book by DJ Taylor called Who is Big Brother, which is a book about the works of George Orwell. I really want to focus in on George Orwell's fiction from the 1930s. I've read his later works. The first one that I want to head to is A Clergyman's Daughter, written in the 1930s. This is a novel about religious doubt. I think it's very kind of au fait with kind of factional infighting and gossipy Church of England of the 1930s, which sounds absolutely fantastic. I get along really well with George Orwell. He is one of my pillars of authors that I always come back to. So A Clergyman's Daughter. And I'm headed to a history book over spring called The Morbid Age by Richard Overy, written in the crisis of civilization 1919 to 1939. This is a work of history on the intellectual life in Britain between the First World War and the Second World War. Think H.G. Wells, Aldous Huxley, George Orwell, scientists, Marie Stopes, etc. I've had this on my TBR for quite a while. I'm a big fan of Richard Overy. I have some other works of history by him. I'd really like to kind of get to this, and I think it will give me a lot of context for the George Orwell that I'm reading and for interwar kind of fiction. Speaking of interwar fiction, I've also made a little note that over the next few months I would love to get to Evelyn Waugh Vile Bodies. I have a couple of Evelyn Waugh novels that I've read and love: Brideshead Revisited, Decline and Fall. I've had Vile Bodies for a little while. In the DJ Taylor work on George Orwell, he talks about George Orwell reviewing this very positively, and he spoke about this a little bit, and I thought, oh, actually I really must get to this because I've had it for quite a while. Interwar kind of 1930s fiction is really my thing. I know I love Evelyn Waugh. Next up is my last ever Jeeves and Wooster. This is, I think, the 14th or 15th. Jeeves and Wooster. I've been reading these for years. I'm finally at the end of this series. I'm going to save this for Easter weekend. I cannot speak more highly about Jeeves and Wooster and about P.G. Wodehouse in general. His sunniness of spirit, the joy that I get from these series. I'll post about the whole series, I think, once I'm done. I also want to get to 5th in the Blanding series, which is Lord Emsworth and others. I'll crack on with this and then the rest of the P.G. Wodehouses that I have after I finish Jeeves and Wooster. Cracking on to, I mentioned in my And Then There Were None review video that I'm currently reading Agatha Christie in chronological order. Over spring, my next Miss Marple is A Murder Is Announced. I believe this is the 5th or the 6th Miss Marple, depending on where you slot in Sleeping Murder. I cannot wait for this. I had such a good time reading And Then There Were None. It really spurred me on to crack on with what I have. So that's A Murder Is Announced. I also have another crime novel, and it is part of the British Library Crime Classics. I love this series of books. I always go to them. Last year for my birthday, my dad got me Fell Murder by E.C. Lorac, a Lancashire murder mystery. I'm really excited to get to this. This is very kind of rural crime vibes. I love rural settings. I love Lancashire. I'm very familiar with Lancashire. I've lived in Lancashire. I don't live too far from Lancashire now. This is a murder happens within a farming community, Lancashire Fells. I think very atmospheric. I've heard really good things about E.C. Lorac, and I'd really like to get to Murder by Matchlight after this one. And then last on my spring reading list is, and this is my big classic for spring, is The Golden Bowl by Henry James. I love Henry James. He's one of my favourite authors. This was written in 1901, so it is a 20th century novel. This, like all or most of Henry James' novels, is about the clash of cultures, English and American. I picked this one because I recently listened to Barbara Pym's Desert Island Discs. If you're not in the UK, you have like famous writers, singers, actors come on, and they choose 5 pieces of music to take to Desert Island, and they're also allowed a book. She chose this. She's one of my favourite authors, and it reminded me that I have this on my shelves, that I haven't got to Henry James in a while, and that this, I think, is going to be a cracking book to read over spring. That is all of the books that I have on my spring reading list. 12 books. I will, like I mentioned, probably read more than that, so there will be a few others slotted in, and I've left myself enough room to kind of go off on little tangents of all of the non-fiction reading that I'm doing. I would love to hear what you're reading for spring, what your plans are. I have a holiday booked in the Lake District in May, so I'm hoping to get lots of reading done then, and I also have Easter, like long weekend as well. But yeah, I would love to know what you're reading, if you read any of these, what your thoughts are, and I will see you all next week in a new video. I hope you all have a lovely day, and thank you so much for watching.